If you've ever come across a story so devastating it sort of changes how you even think about tragedy, then you know the power of a film like Devadasu.
Hmm.
We're stepping way back today, all the way to 1955, to explore an Indian film classic that didn't just tell a sad story. It really set the blueprint for how sadness could be shown on screen for, well, for generations.
It's so much more than just a famous movie. You could almost call it a foundational text for understanding the intersection of love, class, and social permission in so many traditional narratives.
And for today's deep dive, we've pulled together some fascinating material.
Yeah, we're synthesizing perspectives from critical film analysis,
Yeah.
audience reflections over the decades, and some really deep dives into the historical context of social codes in, mid-century India.
So our mission for you is crystal clear. This isn't going to be a simple plot summary. The real genius of this film is in its structure. We're going to dissect what critics have called the architecture of tragic restraint.
Which is a great phrase.
It is, isn't it? It's all about how the film uses silence, internal collapse, and all these unsaid social rules to create a tragedy that feels not just sad, but inevitable. You're going to walk away from this understanding not just what happens, but how it works and why it resonated so deeply.
It's an exploration of constraints, both the internal ones and the external ones. And understanding those constraints is really the key to unlocking the film's powerful legacy.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The core narrative is, on the surface, deceptively simple, but the weight it carries is just immense.
Right.
We're looking at a story focused on a man whose entire downfall is set in motion not by some big melodramatic event, not a war or a murder, but by his complete inability to reconcile his own love with these deeply, deeply entrenched social expectations.
And that's the first essential distinction to make. It's the difference between a tragedy of action and what you could call a tragedy of inertia.
A tragedy of inertia. I like that.
Yeah, because this narrative doesn't rely on a massive, singular, dramatic event. It's a slow, agonizing burn. The film meticulously charts this gradual process. The protagonist's emotional decline, which shows up as this prolonged withdrawal from life, and then his eventual self-inflicted destruction. It's like watching a soul just wither in slow motion.
I find that gradual decline, that inertia, almost more terrifying than a sudden disaster.
Why is that?
Precisely because it feels so insidious and honestly so relatable. We all know that feeling of watching someone, or maybe even ourselves, slowly disconnect, sinking under a pressure they can't even articulate. But what are the specific constraints here that forge this unbreakable cage around him?
Well, the critical analysis really points to three key layers of constraint working against him. First, and most obviously, are the rigid social class structures that forbid the union. That's the external barrier.
Okay, the classic star-crossed lovers problem.
Exactly. But then, more profoundly, there is the internal emotional restraint. His inability to voice his desires, to fight for what he wants. And then finally, there's this crushing social pride, both his own and, the expectations placed upon his family.
That internal restraint, that seems almost more damaging than the external class barriers. If you can't even name the problem, how can you possibly solve it?
It's a tragedy where the chains are, in a way, self-forged, but they're still socially derived. It's the deep internalization of these rules that proves fatal. What's crucial to grasp here is that the tragedy doesn't result from some conventional, mustache-twirling villain pulling strings.
Right, there's no bad guy.
No, or a mere stroke of bad luck. The narrative points its finger directly at the accepted social norms themselves. The film is essentially critiquing society by showing how these deeply embedded, unquestioned rules can destroy a person from the inside out without anyone ever needing to lift a finger.
So, the villain isn't a person, it's the unspoken cultural contract they're all forced to honor. That's a heavy burden for a film to carry, arguing that the very air they breathe is toxic.
It is.
So if this social air is the true villain, how do we shift the lens from the individual's failure to society's wider culpability? What do the critics say about that fundamental shift?
Well, what's fascinating here is how the critical consensus views the protagonist. It really rejects the idea of him being merely a weak or flawed individual. Instead, it frames his emotional failure, fundamentally, as a direct social outcome.
A social outcome.
Yes, his suffering is, in essence, an indictment of the system he lives in, and that changes everything about how we, the audience, process his downfall. We're sort of forced to grieve the system, not just the man.
It gives context rather than just condemnation. But if the character accepts these norms and quietly self-destructs, isn't that still a failure of will on some level? Or is the film just totally absolving him of choice?
That's the core tension, and it ties into this concept of a socially permitted collapse. One of the key articles we reviewed really drives this point home. The tragedy isn't built on active conflict. No screaming matches or desperate battles against the system. It is about acceptance and permission. The protagonist grants the social rules permission to forbid his happiness, and once that internal permission is given, his collapse is, from a narrative standpoint, sealed.
That concept, socially permitted collapse, is incredibly insightful, and it connects this film to a much broader tradition in South Asian storytelling, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
If you look at those traditional narratives, tragedy is so often framed specifically as the result of social restraint and unspoken expectations. The character knows the rule, sees the rule, and follows it, even when the cost is their own life or happiness.
And Devadasu is a masterful example of that exact narrative pattern. His decline is gradual, yes, but crucially, it is socially permitted. There's a sense of utter inevitability because society has already written the script for how this conflict has to end, and that ending demands separation and self-destruction.
The audience would recognize that script.
They'd recognize the unbreakable, almost religious nature of the social code, which is why the film's resonance is so enduring. The audience is watching a sacrifice, really, not a simple failure.
Which brings us perfectly to the artistry of it all. I mean, how do you make acceptance and silence compelling cinema? Let's get into how this idea of restraint shaped the production itself.
This is where the directorial choices of Vedandam Raghavaya become absolutely essential. The film is renowned for its lyrical presentation, but specifically for its notably, restrained performances.
That feels like a contradiction for a tragedy, doesn't it? I mean, when we think of cinematic tragedy, we often picture these huge operatic displays of grief, big tears, dramatic gestures. Why choose quietness?
Because the silence is the key. It's the key to unlocking the true emotional power. If the suffering were loud and aggressive, it would imply a temporary crisis, something that could, potentially be resolved with a loud outburst or a confrontation.
Okay, I see.
But because the suffering is consistently quiet, persistently internal, and critically normalized by society, it lands with far more devastating impact. It communicates to you, the viewer, that this pain isn't an emergency you can fix. It's simply the constant condition of life under these rules.
It becomes a statement about existence rather than just an event. So how did the director actually achieve this? Was it in the acting choices, the pacing?
It was a whole synthesis. Raghavaya used these extended moments of quiet reflection, relying heavily on the actor's internalized expressions rather than on dialogue to convey the agony. The performances are often described as internalizing the conflict. The characters are suffering in their eyes and their posture, not through grand speeches.
So it forces the viewer to lean in.
It forces you to lean in to observe the subtle ways society was crushing the individual spirit.
And here's where it gets really interesting. When we look at the actual audience reflections captured over time, when people talk about this film, they use very telling language. They say things like, the pain feels inevitable. And they describe the film as a tragedy shaped by silence rather than conflict. The quiet internal nature of the pain is consistently cited as what makes it so deeply affecting.
The audience essentially got it. They synthesized the film's unique structural intent. They realized they weren't watching a standard conflict. They were watching a soul slowly wither under constant normalized social pressure. The restraint, the silence, it doesn't leave an emotional void. It forces you to fill that space with your own understanding of those pressures, which makes the experience intensely personal.
And this unique portrayal is what cemented its place in cinematic history. The film is widely regarded as one of the most influential tragic films in Indian cinema. It didn't just tell a familiar tale of star-crossed lovers.
No, it provided a blueprint.
A blueprint for how to tell a social tragedy, making all those invisible constraints visible.
Absolutely. It defined a style of emotional narrative that influenced cinematic depictions for decades afterward. Whenever you see a story that relies heavily on internalized pain, on gradual self-destructive decline, and on these silent societal forces acting as the main antagonist, you can often trace its aesthetic and emotional lineage directly back to the framework Devadasu established.
It taught filmmakers how to show that slow, profound destruction that's caused by just quietly following the rules.
It sounds like this film perfected the art of making the unsaid the most important part of the story.
That's it exactly. It showed that sometimes the most dramatic suffering isn't loud at all. It's the kind you keep locked behind a closed door because society has told you that your pain is either normal or perhaps deserved.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this? This deep dive into Devadasu ultimately teaches us that the film acts as a critical cultural mirror.
It shows us that the quiet, unquestioning adherence to restrictive social rules, that acceptance of unspoken expectations, can be far more destructive to a person than any overt external confrontation. The tragedy isn't in fighting the system and losing, it's in bowing your head before the fight even begins.
And that reflection is perhaps the most enduring part of the film's legacy, which leads to, I think, a provocative thought.
Let's hear it.
Given that Devadasu's tragedy is fundamentally defined by silence and the normalized social acceptance of suffering, we should probably consider this. What deeply accepted, seemingly normal social codes or unspoken expectations in our current society, in our workplaces, in our digital lives, in our families, what might be shaping the next generation's own inevitable gradual tragedies?
Wow.
What societal rule are we all accepting as just the way things are that might be quietly destroying people today?
Answering that question takes more than one deep dive, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But recognizing the silence is the profound place to start. Thank you for joining us today for this look at the unforgettable, enduring legacy of Devadasu.